The late autumn rain poured down on Chicago like a gray curtain so dense that even the streetlights along Michigan Avenue turned hazy and dim. In the city's heart, the Cambridge Grand Hotel, a stately old building that had witnessed countless ups and downs, stood tall, its glass windows glistening faintly, casting weak light onto the empty street. That was where Florence Lawrence worked the night shift, a job she had held for many years. To her, the silence of the night was a gift, though sometimes that silence also felt like emptiness, making it all too easy to hear the sound of her sighs. At 37, Florence was no longer a dreamy young girl. Life had taken too much from her, a husband lost in a car accident, leaving her with a 10-year-old son, Elijah. That was why she worked tirelessly, enduring endless night shifts to be with her son during the day. Each night in the hotel's vintage lobby, where the crystal chandelier cast its pale golden glow, she sat at the reception desk, listening to the rain drumming against the tall windows. That night, the clock on the wall pointed to 11:45. Florence had just finished arranging the booking files for the next day when the hotel's large front doors suddenly swung open, a blast of icy wind, and the scent of rain rushed in. She lifted her head. A man stepped inside, as though carrying the city's darkness with him. His expensive suit was soaked raindrops, dripping onto the marble floor, leaving dark stains. His dark brown hair clung to his forehead, but what Florence couldn't look away from were his eyes, deep blue, yet shadowed, as if burdened with a pain beyond human endurance. The man stopped at the reception desk. His steps were heavy, each one weighed down by an invisible load. Florence immediately stood up, offering a gentle professional smile. "Good evening, sir. Welcome to the Cambridge Grand." The man didn't return the smile. His voice was hoarse and rough, as if unused for a long time. "I need a room." Florence hesitated briefly, her fingers moving quickly over the keyboard. "Of course. Do you have a reservation?" He shook his head, raindrops dripping from his coat onto the polished wooden counter. "No. That's all right. We still have vacancies. How long do you plan to stay?" He was silent for a few seconds, then placed a credit card on the counter. "A week. Maybe longer." Florence took the card, her eyes flicking briefly over the embossed name, Charles Andrew. Her heart skipped a beat. The name was not unfamiliar. Florence had seen his face on more than a few business magazine covers, the man known as the Empire Builder, the one behind Andrew Global, a tech conglomerate worth tens of billions of dollars. Yet the flesh and blood man standing before her now bore no resemblance to that image. No confident smile, no aura of power, only a weary, rain-soaked body and eyes hollow as an abyss. Florence knew well that discretion was part of her job. She didn't reveal that she recognized him. "Would you like a room facing the lake or overlooking the city?" Charles froze for a moment, as if the question itself was unnecessary. "Whichever has the fewest windows." The strange request made Florence frown slightly, but she didn't pry. "Then I'll assign you room 507. At the end of the corridor, a small window faces the courtyard. Very quiet." Charles gave a faint nod. When Florence handed him the key, his fingers brushed against hers. They were ice cold, making her shiver. "The elevator is over there, sir. Breakfast is served from 6 to 10, and room service is available until late. Do you need help with luggage?" Charles glanced down at his empty hands. "No, I brought nothing with me." He turned and walked away, leaving behind droplets of rain scattered across the tiles. Florence watched his back until it disappeared into the elevator. A strange feeling stirred in her chest. Sympathy laced with curiosity. A man with everything looked like he had just lost the entire world. The night went on. Florence wiped the wet streaks off the floor. But in her mind, the image of Charles Andrew lingered, those shadowed blue eyes, those icy hands. He was just a guest, she reminded herself. Her job was not to care about the burdens others carried. Yet even when she returned to her small apartment after her shift holding Elijah in her arms, Florence still found herself haunted by that lonely figure. The next day, Chicago remained gray and overcast. In her small South Side apartment, Florence busily prepared Elijah for school. "Mom, have you seen my solar energy model?" Elijah called from his bedroom. While packing his lunchbox, Florence answered, "Try looking under your bed. You left it there last night." A moment later, Elijah ran out clutching the cardboard board with its tiny solar panels. His face lit up with pride. "Ms. Davis said I might win the science fair if I fixed the wiring." Florence smiled, warmth filling her heart. This boy was her everything, her strength. Yet deep down, she still feared, would she alone be enough to give him the future he deserved? That night, Florence returned to her shift. The hotel lobby was quiet, the chandelier's glow reflecting off the polished floor. At exactly midnight, the elevator bell rang. Charles Andrew appeared this time in a dark sweater and jeans, far more straightforward than the drenched suit from the night before. He said nothing, sitting in an armchair beside the unlit fireplace. Florence hesitated briefly, then spoke. "Would you like me to light the fire? It gets very cold here at night." Charles lifted his gaze, his eyes vacant, then gave a faint nod. Florence struck a match, and the fire leapt to life, casting its warm amber glow across the room. She turned back and caught his gaze, a look that made her heart pound. It wasn't the gaze of a guest, but of someone clinging desperately to one of the last traces of warmth left in the world. In that moment, Florence realized her quiet night shifts would never be the same again. The morning in Chicago remained gloomy, heavy clouds covering the sky, as if unwilling to give away even a sliver of light. Florence Lawrence sat by the window of her small South Side apartment, holding a cheap coffee from a convenience store. The condo, barely 40 square meters, was cramped for them, but it was the only world she could keep steady. Elijah sat at his old study desk, carefully adjusting the wiring on his solar energy model. The faint light from the desk lamp shone down on his face, highlighting his bright, clear eyes, already too accustomed to scarcity. "You have to make sure the current runs evenly. Otherwise, the battery won't charge," Elijah muttered, as if reminding himself. Florence looked at her son, the corners of her lips curving gently. That boy carried a passion for science, for things much bigger than the narrow world surrounding him. She knew if given the right conditions, Elijah could go far. But reality was far from those dreams. Florence took Elijah to school, after preparing a simple breakfast of a few slices of toast and fried eggs. On the way, the late autumn wind cut into their skin. Rows of gray houses stretched on poor neighborhoods, bearing the marks of harshness. Florence held her son's hand tightly, silently praying that Elijah would never lose that smile, no matter how difficult life became. That evening, Florence returned to her job at the Cambridge Grand Hotel. The hotel lobby was brightly lit and luxurious, starkly contrasting with her small apartment and impoverished neighborhood. Here she had to keep a calm face, a polite smile, no matter how heavy her heart felt. When the clock struck midnight, the elevator opened once more. Charles Andrew appeared, still tall, rugged, but no longer soaked. He wore a dark shirt collar slightly open, strolling to the armchair by the fireplace. Florence glanced at him, a strange feeling rising within her. In just 2 nights, this man had already become part of her once quiet and predictable night shifts. This time, Charles was not completely silent. He spoke as the fire flared in the hearth, its light casting shadows on his stern yet weary face. "I'm not used to the silence." Florence was slightly surprised. His voice was deep and resonant, yet carried a profound sadness. "Perhaps silence isn't something everyone can find, sir." Charles's lips curved faintly, but it wasn't a smile. Sometimes people fear noise, but when all that's left is silence, it feels like an abyss ready to swallow you whole. Florence lowered her gaze, her hand tightening around the cloth in her palm. She didn't ask further, but her eyes watching him were filled with understanding. She knew that feeling well. After losing her husband in those first nights when Elijah was asleep, their small, dark room felt like a pit. It was the silence itself that once made her want to scream. Charles leaned back in the chair, his fingers turning the glass of red wine the server had just brought. The light from the fire made the wine glow as if aflame. "They call me the Conqueror, the Tech King." His voice was low, his eyes gleaming with irony. "But every victory has a price. One day I realized that all I had couldn't hold on to the one person who mattered." Florence froze. She dared not ask who that person was, but saw loss in his eyes. A man so wealthy, he seemed untouchable, yet carrying a pain no wealth could cover. She lowered her head, her voice no more than a whisper. "Money can't keep someone from leaving." Charles looked up, staring directly at her. His deep blue eyes seemed to pierce through the defenses she had built around her heart. "You've lost someone too, haven't you?" The question shook Florence. She had never shared her past with any guest. But in that moment, under the flickering firelight, before those sorrowful eyes, she felt stripped bare. "I lost my husband," she said softly, her voice trembling. "And since then, it's just been me and my son." Charles fell silent. His gaze softened, no longer cold, but carrying empathy. In that moment, in the vast hotel lobby, only two wounded souls were facing each other, without embellishment or pretense. In the days that followed, Charles Andrew continued to appear every night. He didn't demand luxury services or excessive attention, only sitting quietly by the fireplace, and sometimes exchanging short words with Florence. Florence gradually realized Charles was just a man trying to find some fragment of human warmth beneath the cold billionaire exterior. And in turn, his sparse but genuine listening presence made her night shifts no longer suffocatingly silent. Elijah, meanwhile, remained engrossed in his little science project. One afternoon, when Florence picked him up from school, he ran up, waving a paper in his hand. "Mom, I got selected for the state science fair finals." Elijah's eyes sparkled, his face damp with sweat, but radiant with happiness. Florence hugged him tightly, a swell of indescribable pride rising in her chest. Yet, at the same time, another worry crept in. Elijah's participation costs would not be small. That night, when Florence told Charles about Elijah, his eyes lit up briefly. "The boy looks pretty bright." Florence nodded, her smile tinged with worry. "But the expenses for the trip for preparations, I don't know if I can manage." Charles was silent, his fingers tapping lightly on the rim of his wineglass. In his eyes, something flickered, a mix of pity and thoughtfulness. "Elijah deserves the chance. A child with a dream should not be held back by money." Florence was startled by his firm tone, but she had no chance to ask more for. Charles stood up, nodded farewell, and walked toward the elevator. His figure faded, leaving Florence with a confusing feeling. That night, after Elijah had gone to sleep, Florence sat by the window of their small apartment, gazing at the distant lights. Charles's image kept appearing in her mind, those deep blue eyes, that resolute voice. She knew this encounter was far from ordinary. It felt like a turning point, a strange current pulling her life toward a direction she had never imagined. Outside, Chicago remained gripped by the cold wind. But in Florence's heart, a fragile flame had begun to flicker. Chicago was swallowed in a dense night, the winds from Lake Michigan howling like the endless sighs of the city. In the small apartment on the south side, Florence Lawrence tossed and turned, unable to sleep. The yellowish glow of the desk lamp fell across her face, revealing the weary lines etched around her eyes. Elijah was fast asleep, clutching his solar energy model like a treasure. His breathing was steady, pure, and peaceful. Florence gently stroked her son's soft curls. Her mind tangled with thoughts. Since hearing his excited words about the state science fair, joy and worry had imprisoned her in layers of overlapping concerns. The cost of travel equipment and countless other expenses was far beyond the means of a woman working night shifts at a hotel. Florence knew she couldn't let Elijah miss this opportunity, but the road ahead loomed like a gray wall blocking her way. The following night, as though by habit, Charles Andrew appeared again in the lobby of the Cambridge Grand Hotel. He is still in his simple dark shirt, still tall and imposing beneath the fireplace's warm glow. Florence bowed politely, forcing her professional smile, though her eyes betrayed the heaviness she carried. Charles noticed instantly, sleepless again. His voice was low, not curiosity, but a discreet concern. Florence was surprised. She hadn't shown anything outwardly yet. This man still saw through her. "It's nothing, sir. I've been worried about my son." Charles set his wineglass down, his deep blue eyes locking onto her. He stayed silent for a few seconds, as if weighing something, then said, "I heard you mention the science fair." Florence nodded, lowering her face to hide her shame. "Elijah is very talented, but I'm afraid I can't give him the best conditions." A faint smile touched Charles's lips, not mocking, but a rare sign of empathy. He leaned back slowly, then spoke words that left Florence stunned. "Let me help." Florence's head shot up, her dark eyes wide. "Help? What do you mean?" Charles remained calm. "I'll cover all the expenses for Elijah's participation. And more than that, I want to hire you as my assistant. You could care for your son while also securing his future." The proposal fell like a thunderclap. Florence froze, her heart racing wildly. "Mr. Andrew, I can't." "Why not?" He cut in, his gaze sharp. "How long have you been working here at this hotel?" "Almost 6 years. I have been working at the night reception desk for 6 years. With your ability and your resilience, that's hardly fair." His voice was resolute, as though he had thought it all through. Florence was flustered, feeling swept into the whirlpool of a decision she hadn't been prepared for. "I don't want to be a burden to anyone," she whispered, her voice hoarse. Charles paused, then stepped closer, his eyes softened, unexpectedly warm. "Florence, I'm not offering charity. I'm proposing a deal. You work for me, and I make sure Elijah has the future he deserves." In that moment, Florence felt the defenses inside her begin to waver. The next day, Florence could hardly focus during her shift. She wanted to push the offer aside, yet couldn't stop thinking about it. When her shift ended, she stood on the hotel steps, taking a deep breath. The morning wind slapped her face icy, but clearing her thoughts. Should I gamble our future on a man like him? She asked herself. Who was Charles Andrew? A billionaire, powerful, cold, mysterious. A man who could easily crush anyone if he wished. Yet this same man, in the stillness of the night, had revealed a fragile emptiness within. That evening, Florence told Elijah about the fair. The boy lit up, his eyes shining like stars. "I'll do it, Mom. I want to prove that clean energy can change the world." Florence smiled, but her heart tightened. Elijah's dream was far too big for the narrow shoulders of the two of them. And that was why Charles's offer felt like a door cracked open. On the third night, Charles appeared again. But this time, he didn't stay silent. He walked straight to the reception desk and stopped before Florence. "Have you thought about my proposal?" Florence took a deep breath. "Mr. Andrew, I'm grateful for your concern, but I can't accept right away. I have to think of Elijah." It's precisely because of Elijah that you should agree. Charles replied firmly. The boy needs a mother who can give him an opportunity, and you need a job worthy of you. Florence met his gaze. You could choose anyone else. Why me? A strange light flickered in Charles's eyes. He stayed silent for a long time, then said, Because I believe you're unlike anyone else. Florence's heart skipped a beat. She couldn't tell if that answer was genuine or just a way to persuade her, but his tone was so unwavering, it was hard to refute. Florence took Elijah to the hospital the next day for a routine checkup. While sitting in the waiting room, she received an unexpected call. Ms. Lawrence, this is from Mr. Charles Andrews' office. We're informing you that all expenses for Elijah's participation in the science fair have been fully paid. Florence froze. She gripped the phone tightly, her heart pounding. He hadn't waited for her answer. He had already acted. Elijah looked at his mother confused. Mom, what's wrong? Florence pressed her lips together, forcing calm. Nothing, sweetheart. But inside, a storm had risen. That night, Florence sought out Charles at the hotel. He was sitting alone quietly before his glass of wine. She approached, her voice trembling slightly. Mr. Andrew, why did you do it? Charles lifted his gaze steady and calm. Because I told you, I want to help Elijah, and I was hoping you could work for me. Florence clenched her fists, her emotions tangled. Do you know, I'm afraid. I'm so scared of losing my freedom, of becoming nothing more than a puppet in the hands of a powerful man. Charles was silent for a moment, then rose to his feet. He stepped closer, stopping just a few paces away, his voice low but firm. Florence, I don't want to make you a puppet. Please become a companion. I've lost too much, and maybe I'm searching for something I can't yet name. His words made Florence's throat tighten. She saw real pain in those deep blue eyes, not a mask. And for the first time, she felt that perhaps between two people who seemed so far apart, a fragile yet undeniable bond was beginning to form. The day Florence set foot in Charles Andrews' office, the sky over Chicago was painted a pale gray, mirroring her restless state of mind. The glass skyscraper housing Andrew Holdings towered high, the morning light glinting across its glossy surface, making the building resemble a massive block of ice in the city's heart. Clutching her worn handbag tightly, Florence stepped into the lobby. The atmosphere was nothing like the Cambridge Grand Hotel. Here, everything exuded power. Gleaming white marble floors, towering ceilings reflecting the warm golden lights, and employees dressed immaculately with solemn faces. Every gaze seemed to turn toward her, not with disdain, but with curiosity, even suspicion. Florence knew well that a black woman from the South Side with her modest background was far from the typical figure who walked into a space like this. But then, Charles's arrival cut through everything. He stepped out of the elevator tall and commanding in a tailored ash-gray suit, his eyes cold, yet carrying an inscrutable gleam. Follow me, Florence. His voice rang out profound and decisive, silencing the entire lobby. Florence swallowed hard and followed. Charles's office was on the top floor, overlooking the city skyline. Light streamed through glass walls, a polished wooden desk gleamed at the center, and shelves were stacked with documents and a few pieces of modern art behind them. Charles gestured for Florence to sit in the leather chair opposite him. From today, you'll be my assistant. Your work won't simply be arranging schedules, but also listening, observing, and sometimes reminding me when necessary. Florence frowned, slightly surprised. You want me to remind you? Someone like you would need that. The corners of Charles's lips curved into a faint, ambiguous smile. You'll understand soon enough. In those first days, Florence was swept into the new rhythm. She learned to sort through dozens of emails, make calls to confirm meetings, and prepare documents for closed-door discussions. Charles's world operated like a vast machine, and she thought just a tiny cog still had to turn in perfect sync. Yet among the dry reports, Florence noticed something different. Charles wasn't quite the man she had first imagined, the cold billionaire obsessed only with power. He worked relentlessly, yes, but sometimes he would sit silently by the window for hours. In those moments, his eyes didn't belong to a victor. They looked more like someone searching for something irretrievably lost. Once, as Florence handed him his coffee, Charles suddenly asked, "Do you think the more successful a person is, the lonelier they become?" Florence froze for a moment. "I think loneliness doesn't come from success. Honestly, it comes from not having anyone brave enough to face who you are." Her answer made Charles study her longer than usual. His gaze seemed to want to pierce through her, but then he only nodded faintly, saying nothing more. Even so, not everyone at Andrew Holdings welcomed Florence's presence. One afternoon, as she was photocopying documents, a blonde employee approached her, tone dripping with mockery. "Is this how Mr. Andrews' assistant dresses? I thought we had higher standards here." Florence pressed her lips together, staying silent. She knew well her wardrobe was neither fancy nor new. Everything she wore was plain, some even worn out. But just then, Charles stepped out of the conference room, his sharp eyes sweeping across the scene. "Is there a problem?" His voice cut through the hall like a blade. The woman instantly stepped back, flustered. "No, nothing at all, sir." Charles didn't spare her another glance. Instead, he turned to Florence, speaking gently, yet loud enough for others to hear. "Here, the only things I require are accuracy and honesty. Appearance is nothing but superficial." Florence was startled. He had publicly defended her, and in the eyes of those around them, for the first time, she saw suspicion giving way to respect. That evening, back in her small apartment, Florence still hadn't shaken off her emotions. Elijah ran to her, hugging her tightly, proudly, announcing that he had received the official email confirming his participation in the fair. His eyes shone like fireflies in the night. Holding her son close, Florence thought stepping into Charles's world wasn't a mistake. Yet at the same time, she knew well the deeper she went, the greater the risk. A week later, Florence accompanied Charles to her first fundraising gala among New York's elite. It was a world of spotlights, dazzling evening gowns, and golden smiles. Florence wore a simple dress Charles had arranged for her, and standing beside him, she felt like she had stumbled into another universe. Whispers and scrutinizing glances swirled around her. "Who is she?" "I heard she was just a hotel receptionist." "Charles Andrew is unusual." Florence forced herself to stay calm, though her heart churned. Through it all, Charles remained composed, resting a light hand on her elbow as he guided her through groups of people. He didn't introduce her as my new assistant, but as a close associate. The way he chose his words made everyone take her seriously. Amid conversations about stocks and deals, Florence felt painfully small. But whenever her gaze flicked toward Charles, she saw something strange. He wasn't seeking admiration from the crowd. Each time his eyes rested on her, it was as if he wanted to reassure her. "Don't be afraid, I'm here." The party ended late. Back at the Manhattan Hotel, Florence stepped out onto the balcony of her private room, inhaling the crisp air of the sleepless city. Charles joined her from inside, holding a glass of wine. "How do you feel?" he asked. Florence smiled faintly, tinged with bitterness. "Like stepping onto a lavish stage where I'm nothing but a blurry extra." Charles was silent for a moment, then spoke slowly. "I used to think that too. But in truth, all of us are extras in someone else's play. Where do we choose to stand so we won't be erased from the stage?" His words left Florence stunned. In that instant, she felt the distance between their two worlds begin to narrow. Late into the night, Florence remained on the balcony after Charles had gone inside. The cold wind whipped against her cheeks, yet she didn't feel it. All she could hear was the echo of her heartbeat. From a stranger, Charles Andrew had become the center of every shift in her life. He had brought her opportunity, but also planted in her a deep unease. Would this step lead her and Elijah to a safe harbor, or was it only the beginning of a storm? Dawn in New York draped a thin veil of mist over the skyscrapers. Florence looked down at the streets from the hotel room where people rushed, as if it would never stop. Her heart was still tangled from the chaos of the previous night's gala. The probing stares, the whispers full of judgment, and Charles's cold yet protective composure. She wondered, who was this man Florence was again caught in the whirlwind of work when they returned to Chicago? But the more time she spent by Charles's side, the more she noticed unusual things. He worked like a man who did not know fatigue almost without the concept of rest. Meals were often skipped, and meetings stretched late into the night. Once when Florence entered his office, she found Charles sitting motionless before the window. His eyes were fixed on Lake Michigan's vast expanse, yet nothing was reflected in them but emptiness. Mr. Andrew, Florence called softly. He didn't answer right away. Only after a while did he speak, his voice hoarse. Florence, have you ever thought that there are things you can't reclaim, even if you held the whole world in your hands? She froze slightly. She couldn't tell if the question was meant for her or was simply a soliloquy. Curiosity stirred within her, and Florence began listening more closely to the rumors surrounding Charles. People said that years ago, he once had a fiancée named Eleanor Pierce, the daughter of a prestigious banking family. They had been considered the golden couple of the financial world until an unexpected accident struck. Eleanor died in a car crash on her way home from their extravagant engagement party. And from that day, Charles changed. He became cold, closed off, throwing himself into work as if to escape. Hearing that, Florence's heart tightened. So behind the facade of invincibility, he too had known loss. One late evening, Florence stayed behind to prepare documents for Charles. When she entered his office, the warm yellow light revealed the exhaustion carved into his features. On his desk lay a picture frame turned face down. Instinctively, Florence tilted the frame upright. Inside was a photo of a young woman with soft blonde hair, a radiant smile and bright eyes. She guessed it was Eleanor. "Don't touch that!" Charles's voice cracked through the air, harsh and tense. He rushed forward, snatching the frame from Florence's hands. In that moment, she saw his hand tremble, his eyes bloodshot like someone whose old wound had been ripped open. "I'm sorry. I only—" Florence stammered. Charles drew a deep breath, placing the photo back into a drawer and shutting it tightly. "There are things you shouldn't know." His voice was cold as ice, but at the end it trembled. Florence remained silent, not daring to press further. But inside, sorrow welled up. The next day, the atmosphere in the office felt different. Charles spoke little and even avoided her eyes. At the same time, he seemed to try harder to act non-normally. As for Florence, she felt her heart being pulled deeper into the vortex. He was too complex and unpredictable, which only made her unable to pull away. That afternoon, while attending a meeting with Charles about a real estate project along the Chicago River, Florence noticed him unusually tense. Charles's face instantly darkened when the partners mentioned a piece of land that had once belonged to the Pierce family. He stood and left the room without explanation. Florence hurried after him. She found him in the corridor, gripping the railing tightly, eyes shut as though trying to restrain the storm within. "Charles," she called for the first time without the formal "Mr." He opened his eyes, looking at her with a complicated expression, pained, restrained, almost pleading. You don't understand, Florence. Everything I do is to cover up a void that can never be filled. Florence shook her head gently. No one can live forever in the past. No matter the loss, you still have the present and the future. Charles gave a bitter laugh. You think I still have a future? That night back at home, Florence couldn't sleep. She remembered his eyes, the overturned photo frame, the whispers about Eleanor. And then she realized Charles Andrew wasn't merely a cold billionaire. He was a man tormented by grief, imprisoning himself inside a cage of memory. And worse, Florence realized she had begun to long to reach into that cage, even knowing it might wound her. A few days later, Charles unexpectedly asked Florence to accompany him on a business trip to Boston. On the private jet, the enclosed space made it impossible for them to avoid each other. Florence glanced at him, seeing his eyes closed, his brow furrowed as if haunted by nightmares. Unable to stop herself, she called softly, "Charles." He opened his eyes, fatigue glimmering in their blue depths. "You shouldn't care too much, Florence. I am not the man you should place your trust in," Florence replied softly, her voice firm. "But sometimes the ones who don't believe in themselves are the very ones who need someone else to believe in them." Charles studied her intently. In that moment, amid the steady hum of the engines, their gazes met in a fragile silence. When they arrived in Boston, they attended a shareholders' meeting. But what haunted Florence wasn't the meeting. It was what came afterwards, when Charles unexpectedly took her to a cemetery on the city's outskirts. Before them stood a pristine white gravestone, etched with the name Eleanor Pierce, 1988, 2015. Charles stood motionless for a long time, the wind blowing through his brown hair, his eyes sinking into memory. "This is where I lost everything, Florence. From here on, I was no longer the Charles Andrew I once was." Florence looked at him, her throat tightening. She understood then this was the root of everything, the coldness, the walls, the desperate hunger for success. She wanted to place a hand on his shoulder but stopped. She knew a single touch could not erase some wounds. On the way back to the hotel, they were silent. But it was not a heavy silence. It felt like a silent pact. Florence had glimpsed the part of Charles he kept hidden, and he somehow had allowed her to be present there. That night, for the first time, Charles spoke. "Florence, perhaps you're right. I've been in the dark too long, but I'm not sure if the light still has a place for me." Florence turned to him, her gaze steady. "The light is always there. You have to be brave enough to step into it." Charles said nothing, but in his eyes, a faint glimmer of light flickered. The night grew even more still after a long day in Boston, blanketed in autumn's quiet colors. From the hotel window, Florence looked down at the narrow street below, where soft golden streetlights cast gentle streaks across the damp pavement. Inside her, an indescribable storm was rising. Standing before Eleanor's gravestone that afternoon, she had seen a Charles entirely different. Not the powerful tycoon, not the man cold as ice, but a wounded soul, restless with an unhealed pain. That image stirred both sorrow and a deep trembling within her. She sat down, burying her head in her hands. "Florence Lawrence." "What are you doing?" she scolded herself. He was her boss, a billionaire closed off and untouchable, and she was just an ordinary black woman from a working-class neighborhood in Chicago. Between them, the divide was as vast as earth and sky, and yet, the more her mind warned her, the more her heart betrayed her. In the next room, Charles too could not sleep. He sat at the table, his fingers drumming unconsciously on a glass of whiskey. The image of Florence's eyes, her gentle voice telling him, "The light is always there. echoed and lingered. Since Eleanor's death, he had never let anyone into his world. But Florence. Somehow she had touched the place where he hurt most, not breaking him, but making him want to believe again. Charles let out a faint, bitter laugh. "You're crazy, Andrew. You have no right to think of her that way." Yet, no matter how he tried to push the thought away, Florence's image stayed firm. When they met in the hotel lobby the next morning, neither spoke of the night before. But between them, something had changed quietly. When their eyes met, both lingered a heartbeat too long. Charles suggested showing Florence around the city before returning. They walked along Boston's old cobbled streets, the sound of shoes tapping softly against stone. Florence realized outside the cold conference rooms Charles had another side he quietly observed, sometimes pausing at an old bookstore or faintly smiling at a child running along the sidewalk. In those moments, he felt closer than ever. "I didn't think you liked places like this." Florence smiled when she saw Charles stop before a small cafe, crowded with students reading books. Charles shrugged. "There are many things you don't know about me, Florence." He turned to look at her, and in his eyes, Florence felt herself pulled in, unable to escape. By late afternoon, they flew back to Chicago. On the private jet, the quiet made every breath seem louder. Florence sat reading documents, but the words danced uselessly before her eyes. Her attention kept drifting toward the man sitting just a few steps away. Charles, on the other hand, occasionally glanced at her. Florence's lightly curled hair caught golden light under the cabin lamps, her brown skin glowing with strength and softness. He silently berated himself for not looking away. Suddenly the plane jolted in turbulence. Florence gasped softly, her hand instinctively clutching the armrest. Charles immediately turned his hand, covering hers, steady and grounding. "Don't worry, just turbulence," he reassured. But in that fleeting moment, the warmth of his touch spread into her, making her heart race wildly. She pulled her hand back quickly, turning her face away, but her heartbeat refused to calm. In the days that followed in Chicago, the space between them grew thinner. Florence remained the devoted assistant, yet in their exchanged glances, there was now something unnamed. One late evening, with only dim lights left in the office, Florence stayed behind to organize documents. Charles stepped out of his office, tie, loosened shirt, unbuttoned at the collar, his face weary, yet strangely magnetic. "You're still here?" he asked, his voice low. "I wanted to finish tomorrow's report," Florence replied softly. Charles approached her desk, his eyes brushing over the stack of papers before resting on her face. The distance between them closed, and Florence could smell the faint, woody scent clinging to him. "Florence," he called gently. She looked up, meeting his deep blue eyes that seemed like an endless ocean. And at that moment, there was no boss and assistant, no status or distance, only two souls drawn to each other. But then Charles turned away abruptly, inhaling deeply, as though restraining himself. "You should go home and rest," he said, his voice hoarse. Florence nodded, but when he walked away, her heart sank. That weekend, Charles invited Florence to an art auction at the Art Institute of Chicago. Unlike the ostentatious galas, this event was elegant and refined. Classical paintings glowed under warm golden light, the space filled with the scent of wood and wine. Florence wore a jade green silk dress, simple yet graceful. When she entered, Charles paused momentarily, stunned. It had been a long time since his heart stirred so simply at the sight of someone. The entire evening they spoke of art, of the stories behind the paintings. Florence was surprised to discover Charles's deep knowledge, not just of finance, but also of culture. The more she listened, the more captivated she became. And then, as soft jazz music drifted from the corner, Charles unexpectedly extended his hand. "Florence, may I have this honor?" She hesitated briefly, then placed her hand in his. They stepped onto the floor, moving to the rhythm. Golden light, tender music, and the closeness of each step dissolved the world around them, leaving only two hearts drawing nearer. As the music ended, Charles bent close, whispering in her ear, "Florence, you make me forget that I once stopped believing in the light." His words made her heart tremble, like a door had just been cracked open. When Charles escorted her home that night, the air between them was thick with unspoken words. Florence began to say goodbye at the door, but his gaze held her still. The silence stretched. Then he lifted her hand and kissed it, a slow, reverent kiss, yet filled with long, restrained longing. Florence stood frozen, her heart ready to burst. "Good night, Florence," Charles whispered, then turned away, leaving her in the wake of a storm. That night, Florence lay awake in bed, unable to sleep. She knew she was standing at a dangerous boundary. This was no longer just a professional relationship. Her heart had betrayed her mind, and the most frightening part was, she no longer wanted to hold reason back. Chicago was wrapped in an autumn night, chilly winds sweeping through the streets, casting the shadows of skyscrapers onto the glistening pavement lit by scattered lamps. Florence stood by her apartment window, gazing down at the sparse traffic below. The image of Charles bending down to kiss the back of her hand the night before lingered in her mind. A gesture that seemed so simple, yet it had shaken her entire inner world. He shouldn't have done that. And I shouldn't be feeling this way, Florence told herself, but her heart betrayed her mind, replaying the moment repeatedly, the look in his eyes, the nearness of his breath. A few days later, Charles hosted a private gathering at his estate by Lake Michigan. It wasn't one of the lavish, noisy galas typical of the elite, but a small, intimate evening with a handful of trusted partners. He had invited Florence under the pretext of needing her assistance with documents, but deep down, he knew he wanted her presence. Charles froze when Florence entered the grand hall in a wine-red gown that gracefully traced her figure. The powerful guests around him faded into obscurity. Only she stood before his eyes. The evening passed in the glow of golden lights, laughter, and the soft clinking of glasses. Yet amid all the conversations, Charles's gaze never strayed far from Florence. And Florence, though, trying to avoid it, felt her heartbeat quicken every time their eyes met by chance. When the night ended and guests departed, Florence prepared to take her leave, leaving the room quietly. But Charles stopped her. "Stay for a while, will you? There's something I want to discuss." The words were ordinary, but his voice was deeper, carrying something unspoken. Florence nodded, her heart trembling. Charles led her to the expansive balcony overlooking Lake Michigan. The water shimmered with moonlight, and the night breeze carried a salty, soothing scent. He stood beside her, silent for a long while before finally speaking. "Florence, have you ever felt like you were stepping into something forbidden?" The unexpected question made her heart tighten. "What do you mean?" Sir Charles turned, his deep blue eyes piercing. "I mean, how I can't stop thinking about you, even when I shouldn't." Florence's lips parted in shock, trembling without words. In that moment, there was nothing left to hide. He stepped closer until only a breath separated them. "Florence, I've tried to stop myself, but every time I see you, I want to tear down every boundary." The night wind tossed her hair. Their eyes locked onto each other. Florence knew that one more step would change everything, and she could not resist wanting to step toward him. When Charles's lips touched hers, the world seemed to stop. The kiss was not rushed but deep and slow, as if he had held back too long. Florence trembled, but her hands instinctively wrapped around his neck, returning the kiss. That night, the long-hidden flame burst into life. They were swept into each other, a waltz of desire and pain, of two broken hearts, finding a shared rhythm again. The next morning, sunlight pierced through the curtains, spilling into the room. Florence opened her eyes, her heart still tangled in confusion. Charles sat quietly at the bedside, watching her. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I shouldn't have let this happen." Florence turned away, her heart aching. Yes, he was a billionaire, her employer, while she was just an ordinary woman. If their secret were discovered, it would explode into scandal. "You're right," she whispered. "We should keep our distance." Charles clenched his fists, his face tense. He wanted to argue, to hold on to her, but reason forced him to stay silent. The days that followed in the office grew heavy with tension. They avoided each other's gaze and avoided being in the same room too long. Florence buried herself in work, yet her heart raced uncontrollably every time her eyes accidentally met Charles's. Charles, meanwhile, grew even more withdrawn. He drowned himself in work meetings, deals. But when night fell, emptiness returned. Florence had become the only flame lighting his cold world, and now he didn't know how to extinguish it. One late evening, Florence left the office as heavy rain poured down. Without an umbrella, she sheltered under the awning. Suddenly, a black car pulled up in front of her. The window lowered, revealing Charles's face. "Get in, Florence." She hesitated briefly, then opened the door and stepped inside. The car rolled forward through sheets of rain. Inside, the air smelled of leather and that familiar woody scent. Charles said nothing, only drove. Florence looked over, noticing his hands gripping the wheel tightly, veins standing out. Unable to bear the tension, she murmured, "You don't have to do this. I can get home myself." Charles gripped the wheel harder. "Florence, I've tried to keep my distance, but I can't." She stayed silent, her heart pounding. "Why me, Charles?" she whispered. He turned to her, his gaze blazing. "Because you're the only one who makes me feel alive." His words blurred her vision, as if the rain outside had seeped into her eyes. The car stopped in front of her apartment. Charles turned to her, his voice rough. "If you tell me to leave, I'll go right now. But if you don't, I'll come in, and there'll be no turning back." Florence sat frozen, the world spinning. She knew that this decision at that moment would change everything. And then, with a trembling breath, she opened the door and stepped out, without telling him to leave. Charles followed immediately. In the downpour, as the streetlight cast their shadows closer together, they knew their choice. There would be no turning back. Chicago never sleeps. Its streets glowed with dazzling lights that streamed like an endless current, but behind the brightness lurked a dense darkness of rumors, secrets, and the ruthless curiosity of high society. Florence had never imagined that one moment of weakness could drastically change her life. From that rainy night onward, everything was different. The distance was gone between her and Charles, but precisely because of that, the danger became clearer than ever. In the days that followed, Florence tried to return to her usual rhythm of life. She worked as before, prepared documents, and maintained her manners. But her gaze was no longer the same. When Charles entered the office, a fleeting glance made her heart tremble. And Charles, even while sitting in boardrooms filled with dozens of partners, those deep blue eyes would somehow wander to her, like a lost man yearning for his only light. But such glances could hardly escape the notice of dozens of other eyes. In the corporate world, nothing slipped past the sharp instincts of those who thrived on speculation and gossip. One morning, as Florence placed a stack of documents on the conference table, she overheard two secretaries whispering in the corner. "Did you notice? Lately, Mr. Charles keeps calling Florence into his office. For longer than usual, too." "Yes, I've noticed. Florence always keeps discreet, but Charles's eyes, those can't be hidden." They giggled softly, their voices laced with implication. Florence froze her face, burning her heart racing. She pretended not to hear, quickly stepping away. Yet their words pricked at her pride like needles. Meanwhile, Charles too had sensed the rising undercurrent. At a charity gala, when he and Florence stood close to exchange documents, a wealthy guest smirked. "Charles, you certainly have a unique taste. Instead of the usual beauty of society, you choose a flower that is so different." The words sounded casual, but the look in his eyes was full of innuendo. Charles tightened his grip on his glass, a cold glint flashing in his eyes. He hated the way people reduced Florence to a joke, but he also knew, once caught in the sights of gossip, there was no retreat. One evening, Florence returned to her small apartment. The phone rang. On the line was the voice of her college friend, Melissa Florence. "What's going on between you and Charles?" Andrew Florence froze. "Why are you asking that? It's already on social media. A few photos of you two together, and some say Charles is giving you special treatment." Florence collapsed into a chair, her mind spinning. Photos. Who took them? When Melissa continued, her tone worried Florence. "You need to be careful. Charles's world isn't like ours. Once the rumors spread, they won't care who you are. They'll only see a black woman daring to step into the world of a white billionaire." The words cut deep into Florence's hidden fear. That night, Charles came to her apartment. He stood at the door, shirt creased from the road, his eyes weary yet burning with resolve. "Florence, I know. They've started talking." She looked at him, her eyes red with tears. "Do you see now? I told you. This relationship can't survive in the light. You're Charles Andrew, a billionaire, a symbol. And me, I'm just an ordinary woman." Charles stepped forward quickly, gripping her shoulders. "Don't ever say that. You're not ordinary. Florence, you're the only one who's broken through the ice that's imprisoned me for years." His voice caught, but his eyes shone with intensity. "They can say whatever they want, but I don't care. The only thing I fear is losing you." Florence trembled, torn between wanting to believe and feeling terrified. "But you could lose everything, Charles. Your career, your reputation, the empire you built. Will you risk that?" The room fell silent, broken only by the rain tapping the window. Charles leaned close, whispering, "If I must risk it, I will." But things were not so simple. When Florence entered the office the next day, every gaze turned toward her. Some whispered, some smirked. On her desk lay an unfamiliar envelope. Inside was only a blank sheet of paper with scrawled words, "Know your place." Florence's hands shook, her heart constricting. This was no longer gossip. This was a warning. Meanwhile, in a critical meeting, a longtime partner confronted Charles bluntly. "Charles Foster, respect you, but your personal affairs are starting to affect the company's image. If you don't control it, there will be serious consequences." The room grew heavy. Charles stared back, eyes icy. "I'll handle it myself. But never ever touch Florence." When the meeting ended, a close associate pulled him aside. "Charles, you're putting yourself in danger. The press has already picked up the scent. Once the news breaks, no one can control it." That night, Florence stood by her apartment window again, the city lights shimmering below. She knew the road ahead left only two choices: sever ties with Charles to protect them both, or step into the fire braving the storm. The knock on the door broke her thoughts. Florence turned. Charles stood there, his face weary in the dim light, but his eyes burning. "Florence, we can't go back to the way things were, but I promise you, I'll fight to the end." She looked at him, tears rolling down her cheeks. Deep inside, she knew there was no way out. They embraced in the darkness like two souls standing in the eye of the storm, knowing tomorrow the judgment would rage louder. But in that moment, all they had was each other. Chicago, Monday morning. The city wore its usual cloak of noise and haste. But for Florence, that morning felt like the gates of hell opening wide. Her phone rang non-stop, the screen lighting up with relentless notifications. She picked it up, and her heart plummeted into an abyss. On the front page of the largest financial newspaper in America, the headline screamed, "Charles Andrew and his black assistant, a relationship beyond work." Beneath it was a photograph of her and Charles captured as they left an event the previous evening. How Charles looked at her so tender that no words were needed was enough for anyone to attach a story. Florence dropped the phone. Sweat beaded on her forehead, even though the room was cold. Every warning she'd ever heard now loomed like an unavoidable verdict. At the Andrew Holdings Tower, chaos erupted like a shattered hive. Reporters swarmed the lobby, microphones thrust forward, questions firing in rapid succession. "Mr. Charles, are you dating your assistant? Is this the reason Mrs. Catherine, your ex-wife, left you? Will this relationship affect shareholders?" Charles appeared in a sharp gray suit, his face calm, but his eyes icy. He walked past the crowd without answering, leaving only a silence that pressed heavily. Inside the boardroom, the executive team was waiting. A senior director spoke up the moment Charles sat down. "Charles, the news is spreading fast. The stock price has already started to fluctuate. We need an official statement." Another added sharply, "You must end this immediately. A billionaire like you cannot let a personal affair threaten an entire empire." Charles arched a brow, his voice low yet resolute. "This is my life. No one has the right to force me to deny the woman I love." The room fell silent. They knew Charles had never been one to compromise easily. Meanwhile, Florence dared not leave her apartment. Outside her window, reporters camped out, cameras pointed at the small building where she lived. Knocks pounded at her door, accompanied by shouted questions echoing through the hallway. "Florence, do you have anything to say? Are you the one pulling the strings behind Charles Andrew? Do you realize you're destroying the image of a billionaire?" Florence held her head in her hands, her whole body trembling. Their relentless words were like invisible blades. For a fleeting moment she wished she had never met Charles. But then the memory of his eyes, his warm embrace, pulled her back. That evening Charles suddenly appeared at her door. He was dressed, his face weary, but his eyes still ablaze. "Florence, I'm here to take you away." She looked at him, her eyes brimming with tears. "Are you insane? Don't you see this has become a media storm? The more we stay together, the more viciously they'll attack us." Charles stepped closer, his strong hand lifting her chin. "That's precisely why I won't leave you alone. Florence, you might be able to endure the public, but I can't bear the thought of you carrying this burden alone." Her heart tightened. In that moment, every wall she had built seemed to crumble. But the storm was far from over. The next day, Catherine, Charles's ex-wife, appeared on television. Her face elegant, but her tone dripping with innuendo. "I'm not surprised. Charles has always been a man who refused to be bound. But regrettably, a woman has to become the excuse for his rebellion." Her words cut through Florence like a knife. Society began to divide. Some scorned her as a climber. Others pitied her as a third woman being trampled on. But for Florence, each online comment carved a new scar. One afternoon, when Florence returned to the office to pack her files, she overheard a group of colleagues whispering. They didn't bother to hide their contempt. She knew how to seize the opportunity. Who would have thought she could climb this high? But she'll fall soon enough. Someone like her can't survive in this world for long. Florence bit her lip, clutching the files tightly as she walked away. Each step felt like treading on shards of broken glass. Meanwhile, Charles called a surprise press conference. Reporters packed the hall, flashes erupting endlessly. Charles stepped onto the podium, his face calm, his voice resounding with force. I am Charles Andrew. And yes, I am in love. That woman is not a pastime, not a shadow behind my career. She is Florence Lawrence, the woman I will protect at any cost. The room froze in shock. Reporters shouted frantically, but Charles only smiled before walking away. On social media, criticism exploded, but so did voices of support. Many praised Charles's courage for publicly declaring his love in a world of prejudice. That night, Florence sat alone in her dark apartment. She replayed Charles's speech, her eyes blurred with tears. She was moved yet pained. How could you do this? She whispered, her voice breaking. Aren't you afraid? Her phone buzzed. A message from Charles. Florence, don't be afraid. The storm may sweep everything away, but cannot take our love. Florence pressed the phone to her chest, her heart pounding. His words burned like a flame in the night. But as the light flickered, the shadows deepened. An anonymous sender delivered an email to Florence with a photo of Charles holding her in her apartment. The message contained only one chilling line. If you don't want the whole world to see this, disappear from his life. Florence's hands shook, cold sweat breaking across her skin. She understood this was no longer a rumor. Someone was watching them, and the goal wasn't just reputation, it was destruction. She lifted her head, staring out the window. Outside, Chicago glowed bright, but the entire city was gloomy to her. Her heart screamed to run to Charles, to collapse into his arms. But her reason whispered one agonizing question. That night, Chicago was colder than ever. The streets were swept by wind street lamps, casting dim golden glows onto the damp bricks. In her small apartment, Florence sat frozen before the computer screen. The cold blue light washed over her face, deepening the dark circles beneath her eyes. On the screen, the threatening email still burned bright. If you don't want the whole world to see, disappear from his life. Her hands trembled. Images of Charles flashed in her mind. His blue eyes alight with conviction. His powerful public declaration. The arms that had once held her close. But right after came the blinding flashes of cameras, the curses, the contemptuous stares crashing over her like raging waves. Florence clenched her fists, asking herself, am I strong enough to see this through? Meanwhile, Charles stood before the vast window of his suburban mansion. The city stretched beneath him, glowing like an artificial galaxy, yet he saw nothing but the emptiness in his heart. The man who once controlled billions and made the financial world bow now felt powerless before the one thing that mattered most, holding on to the woman he loved. His phone rang. It was his closest advisor. Charles, think again. This could ruin your career. A love affair isn't worth the price of an empire. Charles closed his eyes, his fingers tapping lightly against the dark wooden desk. His voice was hoarse but firm. That empire means nothing if I lose Florence. The next day, Florence decided to meet Charles. The small cafe was tucked away in a quiet alley. Soft light fell across the wooden table where they sat facing each other. Charles looked at her intently, his eyes filled with both worry and determination. Florence, I know someone is trying to tear us apart, but I don't care. We can overcome this. Florence lowered her head, her voice trembling. Charles, you don't understand. They're watching us. If this goes on, your career will collapse and your life could be in danger. He reached across and clasped her hand tightly, as though to transfer all his faith and strength into her. I'd rather lose everything than lose you. But Florence's eyes welled with tears. She said nothing, only gently pulled her hand away. In that moment, Charles's heart felt crushed. The news exploded again. A tabloid published a photo of Florence leaving Charles's apartment at midnight. The sensational headline read, "Charles Andrews' secret lover, ambitious schemer, or victim." Andrew Holdings' stock plummeted. Shareholders held emergency meetings. The media spun relentlessly, turning their love into a circus. Florence realized everything was spiraling beyond her endurance. She began packing, preparing to leave Chicago. A painful decision was forming in her heart to leave Charles to him. On her last night in the city, Florence wrote Charles a letter. Her shaky handwriting stretched across the page. "Charles, first I love you. But this love no longer belongs to just us. It has become a weapon for those who want to destroy you. If I leave, at least you will be safe. Please forgive me." She placed the letter in an envelope, left it on the table, then quietly wheeled her suitcase out of the apartment. Outside, heavy rain began to fall. When Charles returned, the apartment was empty. He found the letter, opened it, and every word cut his heart like a blade. He rushed into the street, rain lashing his face, plunging into the crowded traffic, desperately searching. He called, no answer. He texted, no reply. Charles stopped in the middle of the street, lifted his face to the pouring rain, and screamed like a wounded beast. "Florence." But only the sound of pounding rain answered him. Florence sat on a bus leaving Chicago. With every mile that slipped away, her heart cracked a little more. She remembered Charles's eyes, arms, and every moment they had shared. But she told herself, "He'll be safe if I disappear." Yet she didn't know that Charles had discovered the threatening email. And he understood leaving didn't mean safety. It only made Florence more vulnerable. 3 days later, the media erupted with shocking news. Charles Andrew announced he was stepping down from all his corporate positions to pursue a goal more important than his career. The announcement sent shockwaves. Shareholders raged. The financial world called him insane. But to Charles, the decision had never been clearer. He would give up his throne to find Florence. Florence lived quietly in a small town on the outskirts where no one knew her. Each day she worked in a little bookstore, seeking fragments of peace in the scent of old paper. But her heart remained heavy. One afternoon, the shop door opened. A tall man stood there, shirt damp with sweat, his eyes blazing. "Charles!" Florence's voice broke, her hands trembling. He stepped forward and pulled her into his arms, leaving everyone around stunned. "You can hide from the whole world, Florence, but don't hide from me." Her tears burst forth. Every wall crumbled, every fear dissolved in that instant. They sat together that night in the small room behind the bookstore. Charles whispered, "Florence, I can't promise to silence the world, but I'll always be by your side no matter the storm." She rested her head on his shoulder, closing her eyes. And in her heart, one truth became clear. Love isn't something to run from. It's something to face together. The story closes with the image of Charles and Florence choosing to stay together despite every obstacle. They understand that happiness is not about avoiding the storm, but finding each other right in the heart of it. If you have also walked alongside Charles and Florence on this journey, if you have felt the torment, the wounds, but also the fierce power of that love, please leave a comment to share your feelings. And don't forget to follow the channel to continue exploring with us other dramatic romance stories. Every bit of your support motivates us to keep telling stories that touch the heart.